Good morning, Covenant. Have you ever been caught up in a case of mistaken identity? You know, like you're at the grocery store and someone just runs up and hugs you, and then they realize you're not the person they thought you were, and it's sort of that awkward moment. Or maybe you're the person that did the running, right? My favorite example of mistaken identity is one that I found a few years back on YouTube. In fact, it's one of the early examples of how something can go viral. About 13 years ago, this sort of funny story occurred. And to understand it, you have to have a little bit of a context. So when Steve Jobs started his company Apple, he got sued by the Beatles because Apple was the name that the Beatles had given to their record label and their holding company and all that type of stuff. And so they had a court settlement eventually where Apple Computers agreed that they could keep the name if they never entered the music business. Which you all know, of course, how that ended up, right? Several years later, when Apple introduced the iPod and iTunes and basically went fully into the music business, we're not surprised that they were sued again, right? And so everybody was wondering what was going to happen when this lawsuit finally played out. Was Apple going to have to quit iTunes? Was all the money that people had put into iPods and buying music on iTunes, all of a sudden, was that just going to have been thrown away? And on the day in 2006, when the court's verdict came in, BBC News in the United Kingdom rushed to get a music industry expert named Guy Cuny into the studio in order to explain the implications of that verdict to their audience. And in one of the all-time great cases of mistaken identity, a man named Guy Goma happened to be in the BBC waiting room to interview for a job in IT. And when the news producers sent down to the waiting room for Guy, they got the wrong guy. And Guy Goma was confused as well because he was there to interview for a job, and next thing he knew they were putting makeup on him and they were prepping him. And he thought, well, maybe the BBC has a really interactive interview process. Like maybe they want all their employees to know like kind of what it feels like to be working in TV or something. And all of a sudden, the interview begins, and you can see the moment that he realizes he's actually on live TV. We're actually going to look at that clip real quick, I think.
The industry and the growth of music online. Well, Guy Cuny is the editor of the technology website News Wireless. Hello, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Were you surprised by this verdict today?
I'm very surprised to see this verdict to come on me, because I was not expecting that. When I came, they told me something else, and I mean, you got an interview, so it's a very big surprise in me.
A big surprise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we could stop there. You can imagine how the rest of that interview went. He did his best to pretend like he knew what he was talking about. Our scripture for today is probably one of the single greatest cases of mistaken identity ever recorded. It's a story about how Israel got things so incredibly wrong. Unfortunately, it wasn't a funny mistake either. It was one of those sort of life and death mistakes. So we're in Exodus again this morning, and if you'd like to follow along with me, we're in chapter 32, verses 1 through 14. Listen for the word of the Lord. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." And Moses answered them, "Take off the golden earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said to him, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that in my anger I may burn against them and I may destroy them. Then I'll make you into a great nation." But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. "Lord," he said, "why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say that it was with evil intent that you brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them out from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by yourself. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever." Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster that he had threatened. This is the word of the Lord. Now I know what you're thinking. How is this a case of mistaken identity? It's pretty cut and dry, right? Moses is up on the mountain receiving the commandments. Meanwhile, the Israelites are down in the valley already breaking the commandments before they even have them. How could they? Only 3 months ago, they were begging God to save them from Egypt. Only 2 months ago, they watched as God parted the Red Sea and destroyed Pharaoh. Just 2 weeks before this moment, they complained about food and they saw God provide manna. And every day they woke up after that to find manna. Even the very day that they woke up and decided to commit idolatry. Are you telling me that the Israelites didn't know what they were doing when they built the golden calf? Actually, I think that's what's happening. I actually think that they don't know what they're doing. One of the most fascinating things about this story is an element that I think we often overlook. An element that reveals itself a little more clearly if we pay attention to the Hebrew. When we look at this text, we see that the God that the Israelites worship is spoken of 3 times. First, the Israelites come to Aaron and they ask him to make them gods. The Hebrew word there is Elohim. And so it can be singular or plural. It can be God or it can be gods. It can be the God that the Israelites worship, or it could be pagan gods. It's a very generic term, just like our word God. And so here in this first instance, it's not really clear what the Israelites are asking Aaron to do. They might be asking him to make an idol. Then, the second time, the issue becomes even more confusing. The scriptures say that Aaron presents the people with the golden calf, and then he explains, this is your Elohim. This is your God who brought you up out of Egypt. So now, again, the term's generic. It could be pagan gods or the Israelite God. What is going on? Either on the one hand, the Israelites are so lost without Moses that they've already confused which God brought them out of Egypt. They've already forgotten that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was the God that brought them out of Egypt. Or they're under the impression that somehow worshiping this golden calf is actually worshiping the God of Israel. So do they forget which God brought them out of Egypt? Or did they make a mistake in identifying who that God was and what that God looked like? Finally, it's the third reference to God that gives us the answer. Aaron builds an altar and he declares a day of worship to the Lord. And now, this word, the Lord, is the clutch word in our text. It's the word Yahweh. It's the word that God gave Moses in the burning bush, his personal name. This cannot be a God that's mistaken for any other God. The Israelites actually think somehow that by worshiping the golden calf, they are worshiping Yahweh. So the most fascinating thing about this story then is that the Israelites didn't set out to commit idolatry. They didn't set out to worship a pagan god. They set out to worship Yahweh. And that's how easy idolatry is. It's not just when you choose to worship something instead of God. It's also, and actually for a lot of us, I think usually, it's when we're trying to worship God. But we impose on God our own ideas about who God is, or our own thoughts about what God should be, opinions, our own images of what we think God should look like. We make God in our own image, and we put the name Yahweh on it. And that's the idolatry that we're looking at today. The mistaken identity of God. You know, when you go back and you autopsy the BBC's mistake, it's almost embarrassing how easily it could have been avoided. Guy Cuny, the expert, was a 60-year-old white man from South Africa. Guy Goma was a 37-year-old black man from the Congo. The person that went down to the waiting room apparently even had a photo. So when he went down and he asked for Guy, and Mr. Goma raised his hand, he knew that something was wrong. He knew there was a mistake. He simply chose to believe that the mistake was in the data, not in the way he had posed the question. If he would have even asked for a last name, right, he could have saved the whole network a lot of embarrassment. When you go back and you autopsy the Israelites' mistake, you find a similar error. Israel wants to worship the God that's brought them out of Egypt. The problem occurs when they allow their own assumptions about what a God is and how a God should be worshipped to lead them in the wrong direction. All of their assumptions about what worship looks like come from Egypt. That's where they all grew up. And so they're bringing their culture into their worship. And they assume that worship is basically a generic thing. It's basically the same thing, and you just replace the object you're worshiping. And so they create an image that they think represents Yahweh. But what they don't realize, and what Moses is up on the mountain discovering, is that this is a God that cannot be represented in images. This God is the creator of everything that exists. And to make a creature or a creation and to worship it and to call it the creator is the worst kind of idolatry and blasphemy, because it's reducing the creator of everything to something that's made and produced. So God brings the Israelites out into the wilderness and away from Egypt in order to get them away from idolatry and away from false worship. In the wilderness, they're supposed to learn how to worship God truly. They bring their bad habits with them. But after this story, you'll see that God tells the Israelites how to build the tabernacle. And then they build this whole place and space and liturgy for how to worship God properly. It's in the wilderness that they actually learn who God is and how to worship Him, and they break their old bad habits. And so, when they go through the wilderness and eventually arrive in the promised land in Canaan, they will be prepared to worship God in truth. They will be prepared when they come into this land that's filled with pagans and cultural pluralism and religious multi-religious contexts where people are worshiping all sorts of different gods. They will be prepared to recognize how they are different, how they worship God differently, so that they will not commit idolatry again. Now, the BBC story about having the wrong guy is a funny one. And it had a sort of feel-good outcome on the internet. People actually thought it was great. The guy got on all the talk shows and everything. So he had his 10 minutes of fame. But you know, a lot of cases of mistaken identity aren't funny at all. In fact, some of them are dangerous. And I was caught in a mistaken identity story one time that actually could have really ended horribly. People often make mistakes with my email. In fact, actually, I should say right now, a lot of you guys are making mistakes with my email. My email is david.hunsicker@covhsv. Since you guys know me as Dave, a lot of people have been trying to write to me as dave.hunsicker, and we didn't fix that problem until like last week. So if you emailed me sometime in the last 3 months and I never emailed you back, it probably was a case of mistaken identity, and I'm sorry about that. But the types of emails I get normally actually have to do with a different problem. I was one of the first people that got to sign up for Gmail, and so I was able to get the Gmail address of david.hunsicker@gmail.com. And since Gmail is what they call .blind, that means I also have the email address of davidhunsicker.com, or at gmail.com. And you know, there's actually a lot of David Hunsickers out there. I didn't realize that until I started getting all their email. I mean, I have gotten cancer results, like medical data I should not be allowed to see. I've gotten bills, angry people collecting money. There's a David Hunsicker who unsuccessfully ran for Congress both in California and in Virginia. And since I lived in both of those states, sometimes I will get like angry emails, especially when he was campaigning. There's another David Hunsicker who's a professor of music and a professional trumpeter at Wichita State. And he's really accomplished, so when I get confused for him, that doesn't bother me too much. Unfortunately, there's a David Hunsicker that's committed some pretty atrocious crimes up in Pennsylvania. And my Google alerts go off every time his name's in the news. But my favorite is a guy named David Hunsicker who works for USAID. And he's an expert on Islam and anti-terrorism and Afghanistan. So you can imagine the types of interesting emails I get about that. But sometime, and I think this was in about 2011, I was working as a teaching assistant, and so I would regularly get emails from students. And I opened my email one morning and found this hastily written note. Professor Hunsicker. Okay, well, I'm not a professor yet, but students make that mistake all the time, so this is probably one of my students. Then it went on. I've just landed in Kabul, and I'm about to ride north to your location. Phone service will be unreliable. Please confirm that you're still planning to pick me up. Uh-oh. You have to remember that in 2011, we had just had the troop surge in Afghanistan. It was also the same year Osama bin Laden was killed. This is probably not the best time to be wandering around Afghanistan without firm plans, right? Needless to say, that gentleman was not pleased to learn that I was not the David Hunsicker that he needed. He had a case of mistaken identity because he had bad data, right? He had reached out to the wrong David Hunsicker for help, and I was not going to be able to help him. I don't know what happened. Probably nothing. But in the worst case scenario, his life could have been at stake, right? When we talk about mistaken identity and worshiping God, we're talking about something absolutely serious. Lives are at stake, right? The very idea that we could be trying to worship God but replace him with an idol means that we risk bringing judgment on ourselves. If you know the Exodus story, then you know that Moses actually ordered the killing of 3,000 of the Israelites because of this idolatry. Lives are at stake. But I'm not just worried about our own lives, actually. There are other people's lives that are at stake. See, others are watching us, Christians, and they're making decisions about our God based on the way we display God in our worship. Most of the people that I've met that call themselves atheists are not what I would consider rational atheists. That's to say, most of them are not reasoned, logical decision makers who have come to a well-considered worldview. Most of the people I know that call themselves atheists are actually people who have looked at the people who call themselves Christians and they've paid attention to how they worship God and how they live their lives, and they've decided, if that is who God is, I don't want anything to do with him. If that's the difference that Yahweh makes in people's lives, then I do not want to be like that. The BBC story is funny because they got the wrong guy to comment on the news, right? But what's not funny is that actually happens all the time to Christianity. It seems like the people that are always front and center in the media, claiming to speak for God or to speak for the church or to speak for the faith, are always the wrong guy. The people who make the most noise and garner the most attention are the people that present a God that is not the Yahweh that we worship. And so when atheists say they don't want to believe in that type of God, I don't blame them. I think they're probably making a fairly reasonable decision. But what if they encountered the real God? What if they came to know the God who rescued the Israelites from slavery and made a way for them in the wilderness? What if they came to know the God who became flesh in Jesus Christ so that he could guide us through the wilderness? What if they came to worship a God who only asks two things from us: that we love God and love our neighbor? What if they heard the gospel that said, "You are my child," before they heard the gospel that said, "You need to change your life"? We talked a little bit last week about how Huntsville's a boomtown and how our church is positioned to ride that wave into a whole new generation of ministry. And I think that there are some parallels to previous times when Huntsville grew. But there are some differences. David and I were looking at a survey released this week by the Pew Research Center. And according to some of the numbers we saw, that the last decade, between 2009 and 2019, the number of American adults who identified themselves as Christian dropped from 77 to 65%. So a 12% drop in 10 years. At the same time, the number of adults who identified themselves as none or no religious affiliation went up from 17 to 26%, a 9% leap. Now, I'm not worried about those numbers in and of themselves. I just want to point out what they tell us. What they tell us is that at least 1/4 of all the people moving into Huntsville will be unchurched people. It might even be higher than that based on the fact that they're moving from other locations that have probably higher percentages of people that don't go to church. The church cannot assume that newcomers will just show up to town and start asking where they should go to church, or that they'll walk in on a Sunday morning and see if we're the church for them. That might happen sometimes, but the more likely scenario is that the city of Huntsville will grow even as the churches in Huntsville will shrink. I actually think that's good news. I know it sounds bad, but I actually think it's not. I think it's wonderful, because what it means is that the church will have to learn how to be missionaries again. The church will have to learn how to proclaim the gospel to newcomers. And it also means that the church will have to become very thoughtful about its worship and its message. Because people can tell when we're worshiping false gods. And when we do that, they find all the evidence they need to dismiss us and to dismiss Yahweh, to dismiss our God. Our mistakes in identifying God lead others to make decisions that have eternal implications. The people that move to Huntsville have no place in their lives for a church, because when they look around at their friends that go to church, they don't see anything different than their own lives. They still cheer for the same football teams, shop at the same stores, exercise at the same gyms, buy the same iPhones, and have the same dreams for their kids to go to good colleges. What difference does it make to believe in God or not, or to go to church or not? If we can't answer that question, if we cannot show them a difference that's being made in our lives by this truly alive and powerful God, then they will think we're just worshiping another idol. And they won't want anything to do with it. So the good news of this is that I think we have an opportunity right here in the wilderness of modern secularism to look ourselves in the mirror as a congregation and as individuals and to ask ourselves, are we worshiping Yahweh, the one true God of Scripture? Or have we mistaken his identity? Are we worshiping an idol of our own making? In the way we live our lives, in the things we post on Facebook, in the way we conduct our business in the workplace? Are we the right guy or the wrong guy? Are we the follower of Jesus who leads others to true worship? Or are we the so-called Christian that turns people into atheists? It's a life or death matter, and we cannot make a mistake. I think we can do it. We just have to come back to Scripture and ask ourselves again and again and again, who is this God and how has he changed my life? Amen.